Study outlining how the civil rights movement in the 60s managed to move elites in public opinion has sparked a lot of debate in light of the recent protests. But a chart that caught friend of the show Matt Stoller's eye shows that between 1950 and 1973, most Americans didn't think the economy was the most important problem facing the country. That has now shifted into the #1 spot ever since.
Matt is the research director at the American Economic Liberties Project and author of Goliath. He joins us now via Skype.
Good to see you, Matt. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Matt, just tell us a little bit about why that observation is important for our politics. Because, I mean, somebody, I think, our age, maybe even your guys, like, our political life has been defined by the economy as being the most salient thing in the middle of our political discussions. And in light of that chart, why is it that everything seemed to change in 1973? What happened exactly?
So it's really interesting. There was this. I didn't actually see the public polling data until I saw that chart. From the 1940s until 1973 or so, the economy was just not a very important political issue because it was always good. Wages were going up. There was really not unemployment. There were recessions, but they were very mild. And then from 1973 to 1975, you had the most significant recession since the Great Depression. And it was nicknamed the Crisis of the West. And it was the first time that an entire generation of Americans had experienced a downturn. And that, I think you see that reflected in the public polling data, but that also set off a debate about what to do, because there just hadn't been a breakdown of American productive capacity for 30, 40 years. And that's the debate that birthed, I think, neoliberalism. Mm-hmm.
And walk people through who aren't quite familiar with the history of the 70s and 80s. What happened? Like, why all of a sudden did 30 years of prosperity and growth start to fall apart?
Well, there's no consensus on that. It's actually really interesting. People still debate it, and what I went into, when I did this research, there's this theory on the Democratic side that I subscribe to, that there was this vast right-wing conspiracy and business interests started organizing in the early to mid 1970s. And while that's true, it's not like business interests didn't organize before that. It's just that there wasn't a crisis before that. And there was a crisis that they didn't induce. It just happened. So it started in the banking system in the late 1960s, and then it moved into the very sort of early financialized corporations that were conglomerates. So I went over how the train system essentially went bankrupt in 1970, and then you saw bankruptcies of companies, walking bankruptcies, so sort of like bankruptcies of Pan Am, Con Edison, and then New York City in 1975. You saw inflation. And what was really happening is that the New Deal model of regulation, which was based on a country that was laid out in a certain spatial way with certain interest rates in the 1930s and 40s, didn't really fit the 1970s because you had higher interest rates, you had much more a sort of looser banking system, you had different transportation options, people had moved from cities to suburbs, and we really hadn't readjusted the regulatory structures for that new America. And so when you have this crisis, which kind of blew everything up or blew a lot of things up, the country wasn't ready for it. And it sparked a kind of pretty bitter debate over the course of the decade as there was inflation, as there were downturns. And that was the emergence, a new generation came into politics, and that was an emergence of a new ideology. And that ideology was one in which the people who led it, which was sort of Bill Clinton's generation, that's when they emerged in the 1970s, was that corporate power was good, banking power was good. And if you don't allow corporate and banking power to dominate, you'll get back to the terrible inflation and financial crises and bankruptcies of the 1970s.
Right. And well, what's fascinating, too, there, Matt, is that, kind of the emergence of this caring about the economy coincides exactly with, as you say, which is that the political class just giving in wholesale to the financial industry. And our entire economy since then has only been a story of financialization, monopolization, which you lay out in Goliath. But what does that mean in terms of politics? Why is it exactly that we are upset about the economy as a people. Most people can't just point to something and say, this is, I'm mad because of this particular regulation from 1995. We all feel, and you lay this out well, this feeling of powerlessness in our own economy, which is what I think animates a lot of this political phenomenon left and right. What is it at the center of that I think that boils it down to people who are like, I care about the economy whenever I'm voting?
Well, okay, that's a great question, and what happened in the 70s is that first, Democrats were really confused because they didn't know what to do about a collapsing economy. And then in the 1980s, they all kind of went on, Michael Milken's payroll, right? Then they weren't confused. But like for a while, they were just trying to figure things out. It wasn't bad faith. So the ideas came first, and then the corruption. And the Republicans, they also went on different people's payroll too. So,
right.
It's bipartisanship and everything. Welcome, America. The philosophy that they hit upon, neoliberalism, was a method of hiding statecraft through the veil of financial markets. So but prior to the 1970s, if milk prices went up, you would yell at your political leader, and that political leader would yell at the dairy co-op or would figure out what was wrong in that market. After the 1970s, the politician would just say, well, that's just the market. What can I do? Right? And so it was this transfer of sovereignty from public actors that you could hold accountable, that you could expect things from, who expected of themselves that they would solve social problems, to this kind of very weird, opaque set of kind of financial markets. And even the language got weird and corrupted. So people stopped talking about bridges and they started talking about infrastructure. And they wouldn't talk about people or workers. They'd talk about human capital. So language itself got corrupted, and our political system has been sort of dedicated to hiding how policy decisions are made, and even that policy itself can have any impact on our lives.
So what does it say? What does this say about today? What can we draw from this going forward with politics?
Well, I think that we have to recapture the ideology of the pre-1970s period. We have to recognize that policy is the point of politics. We can actually run our society if we choose to do that. And what I see today is a pervasive cynicism, a belief that you just can't do anything about the sort of massive corporate governance and just general governance problems. That's just how things work. Congress is just bad. Politicians are just bad. Corporations are just greedy. There's nothing we can do. Maybe we can do some consumer boycotts, but that's it. And that's just a flawed, nihilistic way of looking at our problems. We can fix things through our politics. We have just decided not to do that for about 40 years. And this is the society that you get when you decide not to do that. So if we decide as a people, if we educate ourselves and we make the decision that we want our political leaders to actually structure markets, to make policy, to make our lives better, they can do that. It is quite possible. And ultimately, we have to make politics work. We have to make Congress work. We have to think institutionally again. And that's I think what the lesson is that I'm seeing. And when you don't, this is America, this is what you get.
Where does the Federal Reserve fit into this calculation, both in the 70s bringing this about and also today as an institution?
Well, the Federal Reserve is one of a series. It's a very important area. It's one of a series of institutions that took power in the period when democratic institutions gave it up. When we decided we don't want to run things through our legislatures and our democratic bodies, our city councils, we're going to let the technocrats do it. And the technocrats and economists sort of live in a couple of areas. One place that they live institutionally is at the Federal Reserve. Another place is, there's a couple of areas that handle regulations and antitrust. And they just kind of tell us, oh, let the experts handle it. We'll print and run all the money in the world. That's super boring. Bond markets are really boring. It's just, trillions of dollars and structuring how everything works. That's all really, that involves charts. And the Federal Reserve has an ideological framework where they call it, independence of the Fed, and don't let politicians touch that. And what we really need to recognize is that we, the people, should be running the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve prints money, dollar. It's United States currency. we should be running these institutions based on our needs. I did a piece in my newsletter about how every single board member of the Federal Reserve is a multimillionaire. There's no one on there who has student debt, who has credit card debt, who has medical debt. And yet we look at them as scientists. We look at them as people who technocratically sort of know what they're doing. And that's really a function not of them being malevolent, but of us choosing to defer to technocrats, to experts, and not recapturing that feeling and that sense that policy over corporate and financial power should be at the center of our politics.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Matt. Really, really important segment. And everybody go buy his book, Goliath. So there you go.
Great. It's a great book. Yeah. Congratulations.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks a lot.
Next on Rising, host and founder of the Young Turks, Cenk Uygur, discusses Kamala Harris's attempt to make everyone forget her previous attacks on Joe Biden. That's when Rising returns.